Phil Sloman here for Christmas Ghost Stories 2023. Delighted to be able to read you a story this evening from the wonderful Alicia Dominguez, philologist, writer, magazine owner, independent researcher. People may know her from Alice in Gothic Land. What I do know is that I have a fantastic story to share with you this evening called When Love and Death Embrace at Yule. I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I do. The first time Angela saw him, something crept under her skin. He was so beautiful, so ethereal, so unreachable. His small, almost fragile frame was gracefully covered by a long black leather coat. A red open shirt showed his hairless, childlike chest. His fingers were decorated with big silver rings, and every time he moved, his embroidered tattooed arms appeared from under his sleeve. No, she didn't like him, and she certainly hated his tattoos, no matter how big or small. The eyeliner and faint eyeshadow gave his piercing blue eyes a hypnotic power that filled her living room with an exciting and dangerous aura. His mixed signals pierced her soul, while his deep voice trapped her forever. No, she didn't quite like him, and yet there she was, mesmerised by the way this gracious creature weaved his love song while swinging back and forth on his platform, unrealistically wishing he could notice her through the glass window of her TV set. "Are you going to turn that thing off?" her flatmate shouted inside her cavernous bedroom. "I can't concentrate and have an exam tomorrow." But Angela was trapped. She was trapped forever in that parallel universe where reality and fiction meet at the end of man-made wires, where the cursed electricity did its job with the help of neutrons and electrons alike. "Have you heard me?" shouted her friend, a bit angrier this time, losing her temper by the minute while stomping out of her room. "I said that if you're going to..." "Ooh, oh my, who's he?" Sandra uttered when she saw the balancing figure on the TV set caressing his hair on one of the close-ups. With glazed eyes stuck on this image and almost with an automaton voice, Angela turned her head towards her friend and deeply, scared, uttered the cursed words, "Until love and death tears us apart." A few minutes looped around the room before Sandra burst out in a loud laugh with the realisation of what her friend had just said. "Relax your impulses, girl. He's a hot musician way out of our reach," said Sandra to her still gobsmacked friend, who didn't know her sudden crush was going to turn her into one of those crazy fans. During the next few weeks, Angela started showing signs of a fanatic and toxic obsession for the unreachable singer. She learned all about the band he was in, when it was formed, how many times they'd toured, ages, star signs, his favourite colours, and even their daily routines. She devoured all the articles she could find online, followed all the accounts with the band and Love's name. He became a disembodied companion during her long journeys to university. His songs became the soundtrack to her compulsory readings. Wuthering Heights wouldn't have hit home as it did without Love's melodic, deep voice singing into her brain. But his lyrics were more than that. They also inspired new stories for her blog. He was her muse. Candles, roses, the full moon, and writing letters to the universe become part of her nightly rituals in hope one day they could meet. Soon her passionate obsession started to cripple into her dreams, turning them into nightmares that she was bedazzled to write down, even in her boring lectures. "And this is the painting of Alfar the Great," said her art and literature lecturer one day amongst the mist of her sleepy brain. Since the beginning of the course, Angela had remained immune to the explanations of the bold, pale, almost translucid teacher with transparent, cruel eyes. He too had noticed that her disinterest had gradually become almost unbearable, even to him. His head, like vine shoots, seemed to hold the threat of soft bony fingers coming out of them. His hands, like vine shoots, seemed to hold the threat of soft bony fingers coming out of them. The ritual was always the same. Between slides he would lightly grab a 500 centilitre bottle of water, refresh his throat to clear his monotonous voice, and continue reading his screen. Then he'd approach the plastic container to his pinkish lips, calmly but in an encouraging rush to go through his presentation before the end of the class. Some very thin lines in his forehead fought not to show his real, obvious mid-40s, and a naughty and mischievous smile drew every time he explained the sexual connotations of paintings and poems alike. Without a doubt the world is full of perverts with or without academic degrees, thought Angela, twisting uncomfortably on her chair, while glancing at the image reflected by the projector on the yellowish nylon screen. And there it was, another face, another piece of bi-dimensional work that had passed like a fulminating shining light in front of 100 ignorant eyes incapable of processing the information. Another work by some not very well known and unlucky artist, chosen as part of the syllabus for the third academic year. Alpha the Great, the teacher carried on in front of the amoebic-looking bunch of students, icon of the supreme and cruel beauty that took men and women to die after falling under his charms. The curse of a Faustian desire shrouds the image like an invisible aura. Many sources influenced its creation: folk tales, urban legends, historical context, nationality, culture, and all the other aspects that give life to works of art such as this. In only a few moments, a deafening yada 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 flooded Angela's brain with all the information floating in the air, whose echo woke her sense of sight, terrifying as a magnifying glass. Working as a magnifying glass, it felt like some sort of intense spell. Alpha the Great is the perfect example and image of an obscure past, holder of a deep, dark secret that even today would serve as inspiration for some penny dreadful short story, carried on the lecturer. Like a Greek god with Nordic features and dark hair resting on his shoulders, Alpha stood from its bright pedestal. In the background, blue and purple colours bleed into each other. A mirror reflected his back, giving it a three-dimensional realism. It was unavoidable to miss the little details of his purply black cloak, full of golden buttons and surrounded by perfectly intertwined gold embroidery. Underneath a cream shirt showed a big bow tie around his neck. Big laces covered most of his hands with perfect white fingers and a big ring, with purple tonalities on his right hand, all in perfect harmony with the rest. That same hand rested all his body, on a man-made walking stick with a magnificent glassy top. In the palm of his other hand he carried a turquoise sphere. He had a perky little nose, his lips were lightly full and heart-shaped. Slightly open, they showed his perfect, pearly, symmetrical teeth. His tidy, arched eyebrows above his big, outlined blue crystalline eyes enhanced the intensity of his features, making him look like a retro version of Love. She squinted her eyes. She was obviously hallucinating. However, to understand all that surrounds this piece of work, it'd be convenient for you to study everything that influenced its creator, whether these influences are literary or historical, continued the teacher, interrupting Angela's numbness. You should also try to follow the same trajectories of the creator to reach the final work. This way you would find out that this piece of art is a catharsis. The death of the creator, the death of the character. Disconnected phrases started spinning in Angela's skull. She was dizzy with confusion. Just before the sudden switching off of the projector, Alpha's image stroked Angela with a mockingly Mona Lisa smile. Her stomach jumped to her mouth. She could almost taste her own blood. An uncomfortable emptiness invaded the whole classroom, which, like her, remained in silence. The only sound the throbbing of her blood in her own ears. Her teacher noticed. She flushed. He called her to his office. That night she saw it for the first time. The thing, as she later called it, was a kind of zombie-like, long, four-legged monster with the skin of a lizard and a horn coming off its shattered open skull. Its teeth showed through the melted flesh of its cheeks, and its threatening eyes seemed to pierce the dream with its hollow eyes every time it stared at her, leaving a gushy blood clot running out of its mouth. The worst part of all was the smell of death and burnt carnage in its breath. In her dream, she ran amongst the ashes of blown-up buildings and smoky ruins. Sometimes she was on her own, and other times she was accompanied by someone else. The chaos was unbearable. They all needed to go forward. They were all after the same exit. The thing jumped around the smoked corpses, as if running away from something that could destroy it, even though it felt like being seen by it was already like dying. Nope, I also thought he was going to tell me off for falling asleep in his classes, but he's encouraged me to work on that painting I told you about. He's very serious about it. He's been doing a lot of research on it as well. He even has a replica of the painting in his weekend house, Angela explained to Sandra over a pizza in the centre of Barcelona. So what are you going to do? Asked Sandra with eyes like two dinner plates. I don't know. I guess I'm too involved in it, too curious and too close to the deadline to say no now. I have to hand it in just before Easter, so I kind of have the Christmas break to get a good run of it. Sandra looked at her and in a serious but mocking voice said, I think deep down you hope that your teacher has a direct connection to meet your music crush through a centenary painting. Angela looked unimpressed at the comment and a bit annoyed, opened her rucksack, took her dream diary out and showed her friend the last pages, who started growing an acute frown as she read through the entry. This is becoming unhealthily toxic and bizarrely worrying, uttered Sandra. I can definitely say your recent dreams could make a good stock for some horror stories. This one in particular is really Dante-esque, but with all the gunk and blood of supernatural. Angela's obsession for love, her new writing style, the sleepless nights, and now this research on the painting was taking a toll on her, and yet there she was, trying to convince her friend everything she was going through was perfectly normal. Even listening to her own voice made her uneasy. And just as Angela started to take her dream diary back from her petrified friend's hands, Sandra, in some sort of trance and gazing at the door of the pizzeria, said, I think there's a guy looking straight at you. Angela looked back and saw this hooded shadow in a long leather coat approaching her. Her heart pounded fiercely in her chest like a mad drummer, echoing in her ears, while this person walked decisively towards her. She felt her cheeks burn like fire and hid her face in embarrassment inside the neck of her jumper. Excuse me. I know it sounds a bit cliché, but it feels as if... Have we met before? The shadowy man asked, puzzled in a voice that pierced Angela's soul, who remained rigid in her chair and could barely look up. I don't think so, she uttered slowly and in a low voice, wishing for that uncomfortable moment to be over. In the meantime, Sandra remained pinned to her chair with her mouth open in disbelief. The guy looked just like Love. I'm not from around here, but I'd love to meet some locals while I'm in this beautiful city, he said in his foreign accent. Was it German, Eastern, Nordic? Angela's brain was spinning, his voice so familiar to her. I've just come to visit a friend and I'm a bit lost. Do you know of a decent hotel where I could spend the night? He's not expecting me until tomorrow. Lifting her head slowly from the neck of her jumper, Angela remained still for what felt like an eternity, her mind speeding like mad. There's something really strange in this scene, she heard herself say, while now risking taking a good glance at the stranger. She'd already decided to help him out. That night, she suffered a very intense hypnagogic dream. She was alone in an abandoned medieval town. She knew that she wasn't meant to be there that night, and yet she was walking up a narrow street. She could feel the cold path under the soles of her weary shoes. As always happens in Gothic stories, the moon was the only light that guided her path. There was nobody around, and yet she had recently noted a sudden presence following her. It looked like the stranger from the pizzeria. She felt threatened, scared, and yet deeply intrigued. If she could find the strength to turn round, she didn't know what could happen next. She knew it was only a dream, but its vividness felt very real. As she accelerated her steps, so did the shadowy long figure, dressed in a monk's cloak. She turned left in one of the moonless streets, hoping to come back to reality, when she felt the coldness of a hand placed on her shoulder. The only thing she could do was to look at the scary emptiness inside the hood of the cloak. She screamed as loud as she could, but without a sound. This woke her up. She held her throat in pain and went to the bathroom to refresh herself. The mark of some very long fingers appeared through the skin of her neck. After meeting her professor for another update on her research, Angela was growing impatient. It was almost Christmas, and all she wanted to do was disconnect from her research. She started growing weary and tired, not only from the research, but also from her recurrent nightmares that had started attacking her physically. To make matters worse, she'd been very puzzled since the beautiful stranger had approached her and her friend in the pizzeria. She couldn't forget his voice, his long coat, and his familiar complexion. She caught herself wondering who his friend could be, and what was he doing in Barcelona. If only she'd given him her number. Then she remembered she'd accepted her professor's invitation for the annual Christmas meal he was holding with historians and art connoisseurs at his weekend house. Although meeting all those people and seeing the copy of the painting of Alphard the Great were presented to her like tempting carrots, something inside of her was turning and twisting in a painful, contorted gut feeling. And then there was Sandra suggesting the teacher had a crush on her and that all he wanted was to have her in his bed. Just the thought of anything remotely romantic with him made her stomach churn. It's the last thing I'll do in regard to this research before Christmas, and then I'm taking a break, Angela told Sandra vividly a few days later, and almost irritated, convincing herself while getting in her car to go to this Christmas meal. But Sandra knew something Angela didn't, something she wasn't allowed to say before it was all over. The Christmas decorations in the street made it look like it was daytime, but not for long. Maybe she drifted. She couldn't remember when she'd started being swallowed up by the darkness of the countryside. The lights of the city, like little fireflies, were left behind her, now dancing in the mist of the pollution. She listened to her USB, waiting for love's voice to sing, "When love and death embrace at Yule, I'll be there to hold the pieces of you." How convenient was that? Had she been following all the synchronicities, she would have noticed how out of place the strange smell in her car was that she couldn't shake off. Was it her jacket? Was it Sandra's cigarette end still lingering in the upholstery since the last time she scolded her? It was in her nostrils and all over her. The scent of decay and death just worsened as she got nearer her teacher's house. The streets, with only a couple of flickering old Christmas decorations, brought memories of her last dream, and she felt goosebumps crawling up her spine. She had a flashback of one of her nightmares, and she startled. Turning off the car engine, she double-checked the address, confused by a magnificent gate standing in front of her. At the end of a long run, there was this massive house that looked more like a replica of a small castle. The gate opened, presenting her teacher, walking towards her with a glass of champagne and a slimy smile. As she approached him, he opened his arms to embrace her while saying, "At last! We thought you weren't going to make it in the end." She felt her face blushing with the thought of unknown people impatiently waiting for her. She smiled nervously out of courtesy, feeling an uncomfortable chill down her spine that pushed her through the front door. The threshold like a portal sucked her in, like that of a deadly throat. Flashes of her nightmare started popping in front of her eyes. She had dreamt that place before. It wouldn't take her long to feel dizzy with so many introductions and presentations that, together with her tiredness and the strange smell of the car still lingering in her nostrils, brought a throwing up sensation in her mouth. "Come on," her teacher said. "Let's take some time off before we dive into the meal. I'm going to show you something that's going to make your driving efforts worthwhile." In front of her, a massive double wooden door opened slowly, teasing her senses until the point of madness. Her heart throbbing fiercely against her ribcage made her want to grab it with her hands and push it down her throat. Inside the room, a fireplace was roaring on her left, leaking the screaming logs of what was once a tree. Above the fireplace, a huge mirror made the place look even bigger. The whole room was furnished with sofas in brown leather and oak-restored old furniture where many books shouted to be read. On the wall on her right, some strategic lights highlighted all the colours of the paintings she had seen in a projector months ago in class that she'd been hoping to see one day face to face. Like that full body-sized poster she had in her bedroom of Love, the painting of Alpha the Great stood taking away old protagonism from the room. "Wow," was the only thing she could utter, almost like it was real. The teacher finished her phrase, grinning as he poured himself a drink from an expensive glass bottle. "Well, you know, one can make some very good friends at university," he elaborated with his characteristic slimy grin, while taking the new glass of liquor towards his lips with those fingers that creeped her out so much. "I'm going to get a part of the investigation. You'll need to complement the research and for yet another little surprise. In the meantime, why don't you become acquainted with Alpha?" he said, turning round with a little serious frown. The door had been left ajar and she could hear all the guests laughing and talking entertainingly, but her senses soon started disconnected from the outside world and became deeply mesmerised with Alpha's portrait. She completely lost track of time and even place. It was just her and the old portrait. "Look at your hands," she said to him. "Your fine fingers. I wonder if the story behind your ring is true." Angela got closer to the portrait, unavoidably tempted to touch the image, its hands, to rub his ring, expecting the warmth of his body to talk back to her. She was so eager to know more about him. The creak of a wooden floorboard under her feet rudely shook her, making her lose her balance and sight of where she was. "You need to be more careful, young lady," a voice suddenly said while a hand grabbed her from her waist. Angela had to look back twice. Love? The pizza guy? No, not Love, sorry. Not the pizza guy either. Well, I'm all of them, actually. It's always been me, Alpha. She looked around to see where the camera was hidden. This must be a prank, she said out loud, realising that the human being she was talking to had been in the portrait for centuries, and now was out of it and chatting to her. It has always been me, from the very first moment you saw me on your television set. You were so eager to meet me, so here I am. Your wishes come true, and all I can say is thank you for bringing me back. But Angela stuttered, scared, excited, amazed. I'm only a projection of your own mind. I'm the shadow that lurks in your worst nightmares, those you hate so much, and yet your love for me is unconditional. I'm your own creation. I've been in your subconscious mind since the beginning of time. You and I were created out of the same stardust. We were destined to meet like Persephone was destined to meet Hades, he said cruelly but lovingly, staring at her. Angela didn't quite understand, but somehow it all started fitting into place. I told you, remember, that day you first saw me on your TV screen, I told you that love, when entangled with death, cannot be tamed. It's not your fault, it's not even mine. Angela was cross, angry, disappointed. Don't look at me like that, said Alpha, almost offended. You shouldn't blame me for this. It's written in one of the greatest grimoires that you would come and free us forever. So you've used my teacher to bring me here to investigate your past, to offer me to be the queen of the damned of some kind of twisted hell. I didn't want this crap. I don't even like tattoos, she shouted childishly. Yes, my darling, but I am now your god. You kept writing pieces of our story, and now you're my willing prey. All I had to do was to use your own fears when love and death embraced, remember? The sapphire in Alphar's finger started to flash a mesmerising and intoxicating light, his stick holding the weight of the imposing and almost cocky figure. The curse had been activated. She knew it was too late. Alphar the Great had ceased to be a centenary portrait hanging on the wall of the professor's luxurious library, and was in front of her, magnificent, irresistible, terrifying. Don't be afraid, dear, he whispered to her. We can finally be together. Angela had lost her speech and kept looking away from this fleshy, talking spectre, trying to find a way out. Where was her bloody professor when she needed him the most? The strange smell returned as he said, Thank you, my dears. You will be rewarded. She looked towards the door in an attempt to escape, but froze at the sight of her teacher and her friend. Confused but hoping to be saved, she saw their reflection in the mirror. There she saw the thing, and the hooded faceless shadow from her nightmares. Before she knew it, and with a snap of his fingers, Alphar blew her up into fleshy pieces before she could utter another word. Only the echo of a coarse laugh was left, and the final whisper, This is just another dream, and in the dream world we'll meet again. So there you have it, Alicia's tale as part of the Christmas Ghost Stories. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoy all the other tales. Thank you very much for listening, and good night.